It's now my pleasure to introduce Dave Woodman, our keynote speaker today. To most, Dave needs no introduction. We are truly fortunate to have him with us, and we thank you for making the trip all the way to Mystic, as the symposium wouldn't have been the same without you. I can say that my first encounter with you was through Russell's book, and then, of course, through unraveling the Franklin mystery. It was so inspirational that I truly hope that someday I would have the chance to meet the man who listened, and then brought those important stories forward. As he says at the end of his preface to the second edition, as ephemeral individuals and societies, ultimately, all that we leave behind are stories. Those stories are key to the success of Death in the Ice and to the ongoing explorations today. Now, to share a little bit more with you about Dave in his own words, Captain Woodman was born and raised in London, Ontario, a misspent youth. That's why I had to say it's his words, not mine. A misspent youth sailing and scuba diving on and under the waters of Lake Huron was followed by brief interludes at university and as a boat builder, until his love of the water led him to the Canadian Navy. He served for 11 years as a diver, navigator, and training officer in surface vessels and submarines. Upon his marriage and return to civilian life, he remained in the maritime industry, serving on various classes of ships and ashore. He recently retired after 15 years as senior master for the British Columbia Ferries. Captain Woodman is also well known as the author of 2 books about the ill-fated Sir John Franklin expedition. His work concentrated on the profound importance of the Inuit testimony surrounding Franklin's fate, and he was the first to analyze it in such depth. Between 1992 and 2004, he participated in or led 9 expeditions to Canada's Arctic in search of the Franklin wrecks and the gravesite of Sir John Franklin himself, and today remains intimately involved in this great story. He lives near Vancouver, British Columbia, with his wonderful wife, accomplished daughters, and an amazing grandson. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Woodman.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Please, I blush easily. Thank you very much. You read it very nicely, just the way I wrote it. Actually, I cribbed it from one that was given that I thought was quite nice. I'd like to thank the museum for the opportunity to come and talk. I have a moratorium with my family for about a decade. I'm not allowed to tell any Franklin stories at home. They've heard them all many times, and so it's great to be able to come and talk about my hobby with people who are self-selected and interested and knowledgeable usually, and so attractive. There's a wonderful display of artifacts here. I must blushingly admit that I came in last night, so I haven't seen it, but I did see it in Greenwich, and so I'm sure that it's wonderful. By the time we finish today with all of our distinguished speakers, you might want to do it again if you haven't done it before, and because you'll have a greater appreciation for what you're looking at, perhaps. It is quite an array of talent we have today. Also, we have a mutual applause treaty so that we don't get awkward silences at the end, so I can count on that. I'm pretty much a one-trick pony. I wrote one book, which the publisher thought was too long, so they broke it into 2. If any of you know the title of the second book, I'd be impressed. But I'm also pretty lazy. I've just retired. I try to not give the same presentation each time, but basically, Inuit testimony is my only area of some expertise. So you're going to hear, if you've ever seen one of my presentations or read the book, a lot of recycled material here. If you've heard it before and you want to approach Mystic for a refund, you're out of luck. But it will help you for the pop-up quiz that I'm going to give at the end. I'm only going to review the wreck part of the story. The Franklin story itself involves so much. There are so many Inuit tales that don't have anything to do with the wreck. So I'm basically going to do in my time a very quick overview of 1 out of the 22 chapters of Unraveling. And because I have so many more knowledgeable people following me, I'm only going to touch mainly on the testimony. So that's what I'm going to do. And what's my last thing here? Okay, the four main, I have a slide for that, so I'll do that. So technically, I'm good. Good to go. All right. That was the slide that was supposed to be up while I just did that. So the four main questions. There's a very vibrant and exciting comment section online about how everyone ignored the Inuit, and if we'd only just asked them, we could have gone and found it in 10 minutes. So one of the things I'm hoping to do today is to show you the depth of the Inuit understanding of where the wrecks were, why they might have been more difficult to unravel, to use a word, than most people think, and give credit to all the sides of the story, how they all interact. This one actually had a better spacing when I was on my computer. How useful were the clues they gave us? By the end of this talk, hopefully you'll have a better appreciation. You'll be able to win a bar bet on that. What should they lead us to expect in the future? What can we expect that my colleagues at Parks Canada are going to find in the next decade or so before I kick off the mortal coil? Will they be corroborative? Will they change the story? What do they tell us about the expedition and how it unfolded? So Ryan Harris, who was the first man, along with Jonathan, to dive on the wreck, said Inuit witnesses were a key element in the discovery of Erebus and Terror, which is a perfectly valid statement. However, Louis McCClintock, my friend, Inuit historian from Joelhaven, also said, I wasn't going to go out there and stick my head in the water. And I think these two quotes together are quite illustrative of the fact that the Inuit technical knowledge, or traditional knowledge of 150 years, needed to wait for the technology to catch up. And that has only happened basically in the last 20 years. Yeah. There's undoubtedly a bit of a racist and cultural bias against Inuit traditional knowledge. Charles Dickens, many of you probably heard this quote before, the chatter of a gross handful of uncivilized people, domesticity of blood and blubber. I love Dickens. I read him all the time and try and ignore the fact that he was paid by the word. There are objections to Inuit testimony. Many of their stories include fantastical elements. For that, I will refer you to Marco Polo or St. Brendan. Many of our stories that are based on oral history contain fantastical elements, does not necessarily invalidate them. It's often complained that they have an inexactitude of numbers or dates because they weren't interested in exact numbers and dates. I apologize in advance to anyone who speaks Inuktitut and to Ken Harper in particular, but by the time most Inuit stories get beyond 5 to 10, they just say Amaswedlo, many. It's not worth it for them, whereas in our culture, we tend to judge verisimilitude with exactitude in measurements and dates and things like that. And they also meld stories together quite a bit. They'll be talking about a wreck with various features that aren't even compatible inside the story. You can't go in through the superstructure and break apart the hull to get in. Why would you do that? First of all, if you've gone in through a door, why are you going to go through the thickness? It can't be both sunk quickly with massive loss of life in deep water and run up on shore. And yet some of these stories, because they're second and third and fourth hand, they tend to get muddled together. And with other explorers as well. That's the most difficult thing, is that to the Inuit, who were very observant, as they had to be for survival, you know, if you want to find my caribou cache, you go to this black rock, and then you walk another day to that black rock, and that's where the cache is. The visit of any white man, we all look alike to them. We all sound alike to them. The British all came in similar vessels. They did similar things. They had similar rank structure and similar things. So it's quite easy for them to meld together Ross and Franklin or Perry and Ross. So there are difficulties with the Inuit testimony. As I say, everything would be really easy if it was really easy. The competence of interpreters varied quite considerably. Sometimes they didn't even speak the same local dialect of Inuktitut. Most of the stories, as I say, were second and third hand stories. We only really have one major story, which everyone accepts, the meeting at Tekinu, which is told by actual participants who met living Franklin marchers. The Inuit are very polite. They do have a will to please their interviewers, and they will. And tell you what they think you want to know and hide from you things that they don't really want you to know. They're also very reticent. You have to ask them leading questions over and over and again to get anything out of them, usually. And I'm saying this in the present tense. I'm taking it mainly from reading interviews of the last century, 2 centuries now. And when you ask leading questions, you get leading answers. And they just really weren't all that interested. Even Takita and Oyer, who were interviewed, who actually met Franklin's men, when Hall was on his way to King William Island, they were out hunting, and he told their families, they said, when they come back, keep them here so that when I return, I can interview them, and offered massive wealth to them. When he came back, they'd gone back out hunting again. They weren't really he had to chase them down, find out where they were and chase them down. These are stories about dead white men, really not that interesting. They're much more interested in where, someone found a new sealing ground, all right? And that comes from their different worldviews. To the Inuit, our concerns were not their concerns. They were interested in family. They're very interested in relationships. They're interested in the weather and the hunting, all the things that keep you alive. 100 and so white men who died, and of course they died there like children. They don't know how to live in our land anyway, so it wasn't all that interesting to them. Almost everything we know comes from 4 expeditions with a little bit of more modern Rasmussen and Larson and a few others added in, but Ray in 1854 was the first to hear. McClintock in 1859 was the first to actually get onto the ground. A lot of this will be review for you, but I never know the level of knowledge when people come. So Hall spent 5 years with Tukulitu and Ibierbing, and I know that's not their proper names, but that's how he did them. And then Schwatka followed basically a decade later. And by the time Schwatka did his interviews, it was the last people. Luckily, he interviewed the only living Inuk who had actually been to the ship. After that, it starts to become, as told to my ancestors, this is what I heard in the end. So these 4 expeditions give us a lot of detail. So we'll just go through them a little bit quickly. Ray in 54 was told, in the spring, 4 winters past, 1850, about 40 white men were seen traveling in company southward over the ice and dragging a boat and sledges with them. And he could verify that it was a Franklin expedition. He had Franklin's medal and cutlery with names of some of the crew, so he knew that he was hearing about Franklin for the first time. And by signs, the natives were led to believe that the ship or ships had been crushed in the ice, and that's basically all they told him. They didn't really tell Ray anything about the ships. So if he had been the only thing that we knew about, we would have no idea where the ships were, whether they were sunk together or apart, and we would believe it all took place in 1850. There we go. Next one, Francis Leopold McClintock in 1859. That's him on the left, and on the right, it's Hobson, who was his subordinate, who went down and made all the great discoveries. Everyone says it was very nice of McClintock to let Hobson make all the great discoveries on King William Island. What they forget is when they left the ship at Belle Haute Strait, the information was all pointed to Chantry Inlet and Montreal Island. So McClintock kept that for himself and sent Hobson off to do this side hustle, and therefore was second on the scene. This is an engraving. The ice is very rarely looks like that at Victory Point or Crozier's Landing. Breaking into a cairn, and that is what it looks like now. That is not, as far as I know, the same cairn, of course. It is a very old cairn. Nobody can tell me who built it originally. It's been replaced a couple times. It's about a little bit more than waist high, but just shows how desolate the whole area is. And it's close to where that cairn would have been. I was told originally that that cairn was built to protect Irving's grave, which we'll get to in a little while. And in that cairn, they found the Victory Point record. So I'll just give you a second to read all that. No, I won't. This is it's the only significant note. There's another one was found at Bax Bay, which only had the first 1847, not very illustrative writing on it. I think one was found that had been thrown overboard near Greenland. Could be wrong about that. But there were a lot of these records, and the thing that's most surprising about this is that it was an afterthought. When they came ashore, they weren't intending to really leave a note at all. And they just sort of said, well, we're camped here for a day, well, let's write up a little bit of a PS. So the most important parts of the PS are that the ships were deserted on the 22nd of April, 1848. That way. 5 leagues, 15 nautical miles north-northwest of this, so we know when, we know where. We know that the officers and crew were at that time consisting of 105 men, and that the loss by deaths had been 9 officers and 15 men, and so that if you do the math, all the survivors were walking away together. They weren't leaving anybody behind. And then Crozier at the very last, it's the only part that Crozier wrote in his own, and start on tomorrow, 26th, for Backfish River. There's been a lot of talk about were they intending to ascend Backfish River and actually work their way through the tundra to the nearest post, etc. As a navigator, I'll tell you that everyone puts 4 in their logs because you don't want to challenge God. So if you sail out of Vancouver, you say you're heading for Shanghai. You never say to Shanghai. And so this is almost navalese. It doesn't tell us really what they intended to do when they got to Backfish River. And there's a whole section of the book dealing on what I think they were headed for. So that tells us the basic story here, that they came in, they went around Cornwallis Island, which indicates that it was very ice-free in 1845. Then they came down, we assume, Peel Strait, mainly because the one to the left of Prince Wales Island is the McCClintock Channel, and it's just always the last part of the Arctic to clear. And they were beset off King William Island for 2 years, and then they marched south towards Backfish River. That's the dotted line. And there's the detail of where they were. They were quite well out in Victoria Strait. Took them 3 days to get ashore as a group. So McCClintock was told that 2 ships had been seen. One of them sank in deep water. Nothing was obtained from her. Great source of pain to them. And the other was forced on shore, and Aglooka was the name where she grounded. He believed Aglooka to be the west coast of King William Island at the time. Surprisingly, he was told that there was a body of a man found on board, and he must have been a very large man and had long teeth. The long teeth is a little strange. It might have been that your gums recede in advanced scurvy, but maybe he just had long incisors. I don't know. He was told that the retreat took place in the fall of the year, some of the men in boats, others walking on the shore. And this document, this is one of, I promise, only 2 Confucius quotes in my presentation. The palest ink is better than the best memory. This is our bias. We trust documents. We don't trust oral history. Many people point out you can lie just as easily, maybe even more easily in documentation, and it tends to get repeated more often. So, as I said, if all we had was Ray, we'd assume that everything took place in 1850, but now that we have their record, we say everything took place in 1848, and that the Inuit have no conception of numbers. As one reviewer said, they don't even know how many children they have, the kind of thing. I was always skeptical about that. First of all, I saw the detail of the interview where they're counting back. Okay, we were here in this winter, and then there was another winter, and then my brother was killed by an ugly walrus, and then we did this. And so I just couldn't believe that they were out by 2 years. The fact that there was still a body on board when we know 105 people left was also puzzling. And we'll carry on. Charles Francis Hall, and here it's only fair to put in Tukulitu and Bierbing as 2 translators who were excellent. He spent more time there, he heard more stories by far than anyone else, and he had the best interpreters. And he was told, actually, about the wreck. Again, this is trying to focus on the wreck. He gave us a latitude and longitude, 68 north, 6830 north, and 99 west, which is very convenient that they rounded it up and just decided to sink right there. He also gave us a couple descriptions, very near O'Reilly Island, a little eastward of the northern end, and that it was near Point Charles Grant, which was the point northeast of O'Reilly, which sounds consistent and is actually factually accurate, though it's quite a ways away. And the latitude and longitude are near Point Grant. So one of the islands just off Point Grant is this little island, which is called Umiaktulik, or sometimes Umiartulik, the place where there are Umiak. To the Inuit of the mid-19th century, Umiak, and still, I guess, was a woman's boat. The larger vessel, you have the hunter's kayak, which we're all familiar with, and then you needed a larger boat to transport your gear. And the women and the children would go in the umiak. Since they'd never seen a ship before, they tended to call Franklin's ships umiak. And yes, I know that over the century it became umiarjuak, big ship, or big boat. But from the original testimony that I read, they make no distinction between a 27-foot whaler and a 100-foot ship. So this could be translated as boat island or ship island, and it was quite close as well to Grant Point. And using his chart, McCClintock, who had never been there, but still pointed out the place where Franklin's ship sank, very near O'Reilly Island, a little eastward of the north end of the said island. So this is all very consistent, and it sounds really easy. He even drew a map. You needed a map for any good treasure hunt. Ticker cat, the two fingers down there, is quite descriptive. That southern one is Grant Point, that's the famous Grant Point. You see the Sherman Inlet is pretty obvious, and there's a one beside the southernmost little island, and it's called Kiwiwu, which I've heard a couple different translations of Kiwiwu. Here's a better view of it. Kivivok, again, I don't know. Where it sank is the most recent one I've come across. And so if you've ever seen, there was a Canadian comedy show called This Hour Has 22 Minutes where an Inuit and a Parks Canada guy are talking about it, and he calls it, you just had to go to the island called Where It Sank Island. And this is what it's. The last major expedition to deal with testimony about the ship was Schwatka in 1879. Schwatka was a very interesting guy. I could spend a whole 2 hours talking about him, but I won't. He found a few pieces of either boats or ship, the belaying pin, near O'Reilly Island. So this was the first real physical evidence that a ship might be down there. Oh, went too fast there. He was told by Puturak, who was actually a native of Adelaide Peninsula and was a young hunter when this first happened, but he was interviewed in 1879, that the ship was frozen in the ice near an island 5 miles due west of Grant Point, and that they had to walk out 3 miles on smooth ice to reach a ship. And that sounds even easier. This is why I started when I was 19. I thought it would be easy. But once you think about it a little bit, the Inuit didn't use 5 miles. They didn't use due west. They have the different system. They don't use our cardinal system for directions. They don't use any of our measurement system for distance. Whatever we're hearing here is how he or his interpreter interpreted what he was told. So we have to take those with very big grains of salt. And another map, this one from his expedition, shows a Schiff gesunken, sunken ship, the other side of an island that's the other side of Grant Halbans, which is Grant Point. So if you determine what that island is, you have another clue. So in 1927, a guy named Rupert Gould made a wonderful map, it's still used by almost everyone, showing all of the information we knew about the Franklin expedition up to that point. One ship off Grant Point, another ship to the northeast of O'Reilly Island, some relics that were found near the Grant Point ship. So this is really the state of play even up till late in the last century. But he did put a little note, and that one wasn't cut off on my computer, but well. The information shown in blue is based on various Eskimo reports and probably is not altogether trustworthy. So even in 1927, there was not a great acceptance of what they were being told. All right, this thing is not helping me. There we go. So how specific are these directions? So I try and personalize or localize things. So it's not like they said go to the corner of Denison and Williams and look east and it's in the parking lot. It's a big area. I know I'm in Connecticut, but I use Rhode Island instead as a visual marker. In Canada, I use Prince Edward Island. And that's about the area that we're talking about. And I was told by one of the technicians when I was up there that it was like searching for a railway engine hidden by dense fog while walking around with a weak flashlight for 20 days a year. It was not going to be quite as easy as I always used to tell people we weren't looking for a needle in a haystack, we were looking for a piece of hay in a haystack in southern Saskatchewan. And that didn't stop everybody. Louis might not want to put his head in the ice, but the Royal Canadian Navy did. They went diving off O'Reilly Island in '67, which is Canada's anniversary, centennial. It was one of their projects. On very little more than the name O'Reilly Island, and in typical 1960s technology, just to see what they could see, which of course was nothing, except the bottom. But they did find a belaying pin. I think that's the Schwatka one. I think I used the wrong one there. And in 1997, we were back. And 1997 and 2000, I had determined that my box one, my most probability box, because of the latitude and longitude, because of the points, because of Couturak's testimony, was going to be somewhere between Grant Point and Kirkwall. And 97 is the green. And 2000, we did it again in the blue. These are from boats. Little boats, side scan sonar. In 2001, 2004, without any sponsorship except for one man who's Kevin. You want to stand up? Wake up, Kevin. This is the main sponsor for my 2002, 2004. And just being the money man would be enough for the applause, but he came with us, and he was a vital part of our team. So what we did those years was we dragged magnetometers, 2 magnetometers, over the ice in a sled behind a snowmobile. And there are no springs on a sled, and there's no heating in a sled. And it was quite arduous for the people in the field. We would not know if we found anything. All we were doing was sitting there with a console in our hands listening for the beeps. Once the beep stopped, it meant the batteries had died. We'd have to wave, change the batteries, go back half a kilometer and start on that line again. And that's all we did until it came south for analysis. So we would have had no idea. That picture is Tom Gross, one of our team members, in his typical cheery smile for the camera. He's a really, really funny guy, but he doesn't like getting his picture taken. And this is a posed picture. There's nobody in the sled. By the end of that, we were starting to accumulate more and more little bits and pieces of a ship or something. Near O'Reilly Island, there's a place called Nail Island to the north. Starting to lead to the idea that it was in the south rather than north. First of all, we pretty much eliminated the northern box, and so we went down there and did a magnetometer survey as well of that whole area, and decided that our cheap magnetometer trick wasn't going to work, and we'd have to do it by side scan sonar, and our budget was going to go from $70,000 a season to $500,000 a season, and none of us could afford that, so it went on hiatus until the government of Canada decided to take up the challenge, and they came back and did side scan sonar searches in the area. 2010, 12, and 13, I think is what I'm showing here, Jonathan, and concentrated on the southern O'Reilly Island area. And that's a massive amount of work. It's hard for anyone to appreciate that when you're out in the little boats, you can't even see the islets. You feel like you're in deep sea, just bouncing around in a tiny boat looking at a screen for hours and hours and hours. Looking for shipwreck is not really exciting minute by minute. You're just looking for that one adrenaline surge when you find something. And picture shows Jonathan and Ryan just showing just how exciting it is. And that's my favorite picture of Jonathan, showing how exciting this is. And that's what they were doing. That's what we do. We cut the grass back and forth on the lines, making sure you leave no little holidays in the middle, and looking for the elusive signal that will tell you found something. And year after year after year, nothing happens. So my other Confucius quote, the hardest thing to find of all is to find a black cat in a dark room, especially if there's no cat. And by the end of 2013, it was starting to look like there was no cat. We'd done pretty much what everyone thought was the primary boxes. So they got lucky. In 2014, every year actually, the shore work was done as well. People would walk the shores looking for artifacts. I usually say shipwrecks are found in the library, but shipwrecks are often also found by artifacts being found ashore. And in 2014, they went to set up a GPS station on a little islet that no one had ever visited before. And Doug Stenton, who's one of our speakers later today, found this piece of wood which covered the hawse pipe on a Royal Navy ship, which was exciting. And a few minutes later, found this, the famous pintle, which is used, maybe Jonathan mentions this, but that's a major piece of metal that would not have been taken there easily. And it had broad arrow on it, which is how the Royal Navy marked their valuables. So now that was the best clue as to where it could be focused. And then basically the next day, this famous sonar image, as the investigator with our buddies went over it and found the Erebus. Didn't know it was the Erebus at the time. There you are, September 2nd, 2014. It's my favorite picture of the wreck. The wreck was actually found in much shallower water than I had anticipated. It's in excellent condition, the hull. Well, I'll let Jonathan talk about it, but there you see a view of the deck beams. Now, Parks Canada don't want pirates and tourists and everyone to go to find the wreck, so they're very protective of its position. No one in Parks Canada has officially told me where it is, but I know that you people are all trustworthy and you're all interested. There's a picture of it from the air, hovering over it with a helicopter. And that's where it is. So what did the Inuit tell us about that ship? Well, Puturek thought that on their first visit, the people thought they saw whites on board. They were too afraid to approach the ship, but they were sure that there were people on board. When he went on board, eventually he saw that there was a pile of dirt on one side of the cabin door. This is the Navy. And that some white man had swept out the cabin. And he found a plank extending from the ship to the ice. And they believe the white man lived in the ship until the fall and then moved on to the mainland. Well, again, 105 men left in 1848. What are these guys doing there? In one place on the ship, they found many things. Guns, that's a rifle that was recovered from the Erebus. Very good buckets and boxes, the kind of thing that they love to find. They found, again, I don't know why this is getting caught off, knives, forks, spoons, pans, plates. Those are plates and spoons recovered. They took knives and forks and things, other things like the books. They found books on board they had no use for. So we're all hoping that those are the library books they're talking about, off the shelves, and not the ship's logs. That's a picture showing the plate just before recovery on the deck. Some white men must have lived through the winter there. They had heard, not seen, but heard of tracks of forest rangers being seen on the land adjacent to the ship. They saw scrapings and sweepings alongside. This is a different interviewee, so it's corroboration, which seemed to have been brushed off by the people who'd been living on board. And Utsusitu was the land east of O'Reilly where the vessel sank and where the tracks of 3 kablunas and a dog were seen on the land. Some stories say 4 white men, some say 3, some mention the dog, some don't mention the dog. But white men's footprints are so different in the snow than Inuit footprints. Inuit tended to be pigeon-toed and they had soft boots. White men had splayed feet and deep heel marks. So it was quite obvious to them, more than we would think, that these were not Inuit tracks. Here we go, fresh tracks seen of 4 men and a dog. One man from his running steps was a very great hunter, taking very long steps. He was probably just tall. The natives tracked the men a long distance and found where they'd killed and eaten a young deer. This is the kind of thing that was important to them. So what's the rest of the evidence for a return to the ships? And I must say right away that even if you read a modern book written in the last 10 years about the Franklin expedition, very few people will go as far as to say the ships were remanned. I've always thought that there was plenty of evidence that they were, but that's because I'm an Inuit testimony guy. There was some evidence. McCClintock thought he found a boat in Erebus Bay that was directed to the northeast, and that led him to satisfy his own mind that the boat was returning to the ships, though he sort of undercut his own argument by mentioning that it was barely, if at all, above the reach of occasional tides. And this grave was found where Crozier came ashore with his 105 men by Schwatka. And at that grave, he found this little medal, which was given to Lieutenant John Irving when he was younger as a mathematical prize. I guess he was a good mathematician. Sort of a strange thing to carry along with you in the Arctic, I would think. I don't take my university transcript with me wherever I go, but we're glad he did, because it tended to help. There we go. Well, there's John Irving, who, when they stopped on their way over to Greenland, was called the handsomest officer on the expedition by a young lady. Leave that up to you. This thing really doesn't like me. There we go. And the reason he is important is that he's the one that went the 2.5 miles. They called it 4 miles, but it's hard to judge distance in the Arctic, and I'm sure it felt like 4 miles, to the north to pick up the record that they put the addendum on. Obviously, they got there. They weren't intending to write anything, and somebody says, well, last year, Gore left a record up at James Ross's cairn, and let's go get that one, and we can write on that. And unfortunately, the Victory Point record wastes way too many of its 138 words on explaining that. But the point is that if you have 105 men under your command, you don't send a sick guy on an 8-mile round trip to pick up a piece of paper. You find somebody else. What is he doing dead? What is his grave doing there? They left the next day. Crozier said they were going to leave the next day. So that sort of implies he might have been coming back. In 1994, we were there trying to map by brand new GPS. It's much better done now, but in 94, GPS was new. All of the features at Crozier Point, and we found this rectangular little excavation or construction. And I was sure that it was just maybe for gear. It's rectangular, it's about the same size as a big chest. And people said, oh, it's a grave, and I said, no, it's not a grave, it's not a grave. But you'll notice there's this weird wedge-shaped rock which shows up in the engraving of Irving's grave. It's the same rock, and you can compare the other rocks as well, and I'm pretty convinced it's the same place. And there's a young, fit, non-gray me, proving that it can't be a grave because it's way too short. But it's a little creepy that I might have been the first person to lie in Irving's grave since Irving. Other evidence that the ship was manned, at least partially, remanned, is that when they broke into the ship, they found a very large white man who was dead, a very tall man. Flesh about the man. His remains quite perfect, but the place smelled very bad, and he had his clothes all on. And Schwatka found was given, he didn't find, he was given a black painted board that had been at the head of a bunk or on top of a locker. It was covered with heavy black oilcloth in which were driven brass-headed tacks. Now, the brass-headed tacks would have been interesting to the Inuit. They could use them as decorations. And at the time, the tacks formed the initials LF or LF, depending on whether you use the L as a lowercase or a higher case. And the natives indicated that it was torn from the interior of the ship. There has been a lot of ink spilled on this thing. Syriacs spent a lot of time trying to find out whether any officer or crew with those initials had ever served on Erebus and Terror, whether it was in the Antarctic or previous life. Could find nobody. One writer said that actually it didn't come from the ship, it came from a sled that was named Lady Franklin. Others pointed out that lieutenant in American, is usually called a luff, which is true. So it might have just been that. I always thought that it was easy to take tacks out and leave LF, but if you did, and again this isn't showing up, they might have taken the whole R out, part of the I out, and the F is easily closed into a P. A black covered thing taken seemed to make a lot more sense. And I think this is the only original thing in my book. The final piece of evidence that something must have happened to drive the men back to their ship is that they said so. The only one time they were met on the march by the Inuit, their leader, who was nicknamed Aglooka to the Inuit, pointed to the north, drawing his hand and arm from that direction. He moved his body in a falling direction, dropped his head sideways into his hand, making a kind of whirring, buzzing, and wind-blowing noise. That must have been something to see. This is the pantomimic representation of ships being crushed in the ice. Well, when they left the ships, they were obviously close enough to communicate to all leave at the same day, and there's no indication that they were damaged. So, somewhere along the line, he knew that at least one of his ships had been damaged. I can't imagine how you could do that unless you'd gone back to the ships and then seen it. And there are also many other Inuit stories talking about the ship that sank in deep water, was nipped, broken up. And so he's corroborating Inuit testimony himself, and this is basically the only thing we have from a member of the Franklin expedition at all, besides the record. We'll just move quickly on to the Terror and what we are told about the Terror. Many of the white men came ashore and camped during the summer. Camp had one big tent and several smaller ones. Well, again, just this tells us that the Inuit visited ships. There's no mention that they ever visited the ships in the north before 1848. It's not on the record. And they never went to the north. They didn't know that Franklin's men had been to the northwest coast. They never pillaged their camps. They tell us again explicitly that the only time they knew that Franklin's men had been north of Erebus Bay was when McCClintock went back and his guides told them, hey, you guys, there's stuff to the north as well. The first year is interesting because it implies that there were first and second years. So a long interaction. The camp was about 1/4 of a mile back from the beach, about the same distance south of where the ship's boats usually landed. Well, if you'll remember the slide of where the ships were abandoned, they were 5 leagues north-northwest. That's 15 miles away from the coast. You would not be landing ship's boats over that ice that distance. So there were really 2 places where we know of major Franklin camps. One is in Erebus Bay, to the north edge of Graham Gore Peninsula, and the other one is in Terror Bay, to the south end. To make these clues fit into that testimony, I started to focus on Erebus Bay. Another story of a visit was that an Inuit went over to the ships and the captain took him on deck and pointed to a spot where there was a big tent on shore. He asked him if he saw the tent. The Inuit said he did. And the captain told him that neither he nor any of his people should ever go there. And so that again implies that at some point or other the ship was quite close to the shore. You can't see a tent on shore from very far out. So the criteria for the second ship for me were that it had to be north of Washington Bay, where we got the Aglooka talking about it. They had to be near where a boat could land, a boat place, where there was a major Franklin camp, and a tent had to be visible from the decks of the ship. And I picked Erebus Bay. Erebus Bay is in a direct line from where the ships were abandoned. You can follow a shore lead most years if you look at the ice charts, and that's what Erebus Bay looks like, near the boat place. They did find remains, and there's a plaque there. The number of remains has been going up steadily over the last 2 decades. Started off, the tales talk about 2 men in a boat, then they identified 11. I think they're up to about 23 now, 23 individuals. So it was a major, major encampment. And it's also the focus of the cannibalism stories, is Erebus Bay. So I kept trying to convince the guys at Parks to go take a look at Erebus Bay, but they didn't really want to. So from 2011 to 2014, they started looking in Alexander Strait between Graham Gore and the Geographical Society Islands. And it's not that they're not smart guys, but that's where the ice drift would have taken the ships. And so if you aren't totally bought into the remand idea, this is a very valid place to go look. It's also a good place if you're partnering with Canadian Hydrographic Services, because Erebus Bay is not a place that ships go or would want to ever go. But I kept trying to get them to go into that black air oval, and they were very reluctant. So about 2 months before the ship was found, I finally said, I'm going to post this online. I think Russell put it on his website, saying this is why they should be looking in Erebus Bay. And 2 months later, I was proven wrong by Sammy Cogvick. There had been stories about shipwreck in Terror Bay before. There had been stories about shipwrecks at Matty Island and at Taylor Island and in Chantry Inlet. You could get stories about anywhere in the Central Arctic. Franklin's men, somebody would come up and say, I'll tell you a secret. And so there had been stories, but Sammy Cogvick in 2016 was being embarked on one of the Schurz partners, the Arctic Research Foundation ship, the Bergman, and he said that he had, I don't know how many years previously, seen a mast sticking out of the ice in Terror Bay. And the captain decided, since they were going right past Terror Bay, you might as well divert in. There's the Bergman. And they did a couple hours search and found nothing, and then turned around to leave and go join the rest of the fleet. And their echo sounder, their navigation echo sounder, not their survey echo sounder, went over and got this image. Eventually, they got this image with the side scan. It shows the davits are still out. This is the Terror. Erebus is in 11 meters. She's susceptible to weather. The Terror's in 24. She's pristine. So how pristine? Well, there's a model of the ship's wheel, and there's the ship's wheel. She will be a treasure trove whenever they get to her. So this is what the state of play seems to be now, is I always was fixated on either Grant Point or O'Reilly until one man who's much wiser than me, called Marc-André Bernier, said, well, maybe it didn't sink where it was first seen. Maybe they saw it at Grant Point, makes sense, and then they abandoned it, and then it went south and sank pretty much in southerly Wilmot and Cramden Bay, right where I showed you, which makes a lot of sense to me now. I don't know how I could have spent so many years not figuring that out, since both places seem to have evidence and both places seem to be consistent. How the Terror got into Terror Bay, which is quite lucky, go to the bay you're named for, and it was not named because they found it there, it was named many years before, to the camp that I thought was very unlikely, I'm still mystified by. It also makes Erebus Bay even more challenging to think about, because if they manned that ship and took it there, they were sailing past probably an older camp. I can't imagine why they would go north and start a new camp. What was that camp all about? Is that where the 1848 guys ended up before they turned around and went back? Maybe, I don't know. I've told people I'm not going to speculate anymore. There's too many people are going to prove me wrong too quickly. So the answer to was the Inuit testimony ignored? No. We had to wait. We had to decipher it. We had to wait for the technology to get to the point where we could actually use it for something. And that has all come together, in my opinion, very well. Historians like the Inuit testimony. Archaeologists are fixated on artifacts. But together, both sides were necessary. The Inuit testimony was essential, but not sufficient. And just to show you why we do this is some days you get days like that. Thank you. Pardon me? If I haven't gone over time?
Yeah, no, we're
Yeah.
good.
I'm told I can do some questions.
Yeah, we're just going to do a few questions at the moment, and then make sure that we leave room for our next panel discussion. And then, as you'll see on the back of your schedule, there's a nice window at the end of the day for an open question period, because we know just a few minutes won't sate this crowd. So just 2 or 3 questions for Dave. And hold on. Is this on?
There you go.
Hello. If you do have a question, please do come up and use the microphone, in part so that people can hear you, but also because we're recording this. You're all stupefied. There you go.
All right, now that you've found your personal holy grail after searching 20 plus years,
I started in 1975.
thank you. What have you got to look forward to? Or is there a spin-off from this that you can logically step from actively seeking these vessels, to something else.
This is why I'm amazed that people keep asking me to do things like this, because I, for 20 years, gave a presentation saying, the Inuit say, go here and look and you'll find a ship. They went there and eventually and looked and found a ship. My part is done. I started off as a teenage wreck diver just wanting to dive on a virgin wreck that no one else had ever found. Like I say, I thought it would take me 2 years. Right now, I should mention that I'm retired on half pay and that my book is available everywhere. And if you combine it with a big chocolate Easter bunny, it makes a wonderful gift. But I am working on another manuscript, which is not this technical. It's basically to give credit to people like Kevin, people who worked with me, and other people who worked behind the scenes that no one ever heard of. And just it's more a first-person narrative of my involvement over the years. And now I just keep pestering Parks Canada to get more dive time because I've only got 20 years left on the planet and they have to solve this for me. But I just feel really happy. Very few people can have a teenage dream that actually comes true, right? And so this is great.
Where do you think it's most likely Franklin was buried?
I think he was buried ashore on the northwest coast of King William Island. I don't think they put him in a rum barrel like they did with Nelson. You know, they did that because they knew he would go home soon. I don't think they put him through the ice. They didn't put ordinary seamen through the ice on any expedition. If they were close, if at all possible, they would put them ashore in a tomb. And we have Inuit stories about a tomb, a very elaborate tomb. And I spent 2 years looking along that coast, and others have looked as well, and we haven't found it yet. Someday someone will be polar bear hunting or caribou, well, there's no caribou up there, but seal hunting maybe, or whatever, and they're going to stumble over it, and it'll be big news. Unfortunately, it might not be that big a news, because the last story we have said that the tomb had been despoiled a little bit. It was just basically a few tattered pieces of uniform and bones. But the fact that they dug deeply, waist deep for haul, into the permafrost means this was not ordinary seaman Bloggins. This was somebody. And nearby there was a place that was cemented over that was only 2 feet by 2 feet. And all the Inuit guides said, we know what's under there, paper. And so that's a big dream too, because if they buried their logs and other scientific findings in a vault, they will still be there. So I'm still hoping that somebody will find that. I'm glad. I'm an old guy now, but there's a younger generation still out there looking. Tom Gross is still out there. He's not that much younger than me, but he's out there. And we've got Parks guys working on the ship, so I can sit home and play with my grandson and just wait for the news like everyone else.
Yes, it was common practice in the British Navy and indeed any British maritime vessel that if the commander died, he would be preserved in salts and brought home to England's green and pleasant land. Now, Lorenzo Learmouth reported a giant corpse. Now, Franklin was a portly gentleman, and death might have made him even more inflated. And do you think this giant corpse might well have been Franklin preserved in salts, being not able to get back to England, but there in the I can't remember whether it was the Erebus or the Terror, but what do you think about that theory?
I think I said I'm going to stop speculating because I've been proven wrong too many times, but I am fairly convinced that Parks is going to find human remains underneath the collapsed captain's cabin on the Erebus. It could be Franklin. I don't really think it is, but it might be. As for how they preserved them, whether they used rum or salts or whatever, I'll leave that up to people who are more technically expert in preserving commanders than I am. So yeah, we're still working in the realm of informed speculation about Franklin, really. There's still a lot more questions than answers.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Okay, thank you.